My name is Edward, and I'm a storyteller, though many of the stories that I tell are not truly my own. Often the main characters are women and girls that I have not met and likely will not ever meet. The stories that I tell are about women and girls that have experienced significant amounts of trauma, the likes of which I will never know or fully understand. My role as a storyteller is significantly informed by the work that I do at Real Escape from the Sex Trade. The stories that I tell are about victims of sex trafficking and women exiting the sex trade. And y'all, I am not as much fun as I used to be at parties. So Edward, what do you do? Well, have a seat and pour a stiff one, because this is going to take a couple of minutes. But these women, though, and their stories have become a huge part of my life and my passion and my purpose and my parenting. And these stories make movement, and they cultivate transformation. And out of these stories, I have seen hearers respond with the kind of radical generosity that changes the future of the women that we're serving and changes the future of our community. So I tell them wholeheartedly. And I tell these stories because the main characters, the women, cannot tell the stories themselves, not yet, because they lack the agency and the platform and the access and the visibility to do so. So I have the privilege and the blessing and the burden of standing in the gap for them. And this may not be the kind of story that you were hoping to hear, but this is the kind of story that can create movement makers. This is the story of Brianna. And Brianna is a teenage girl walking through Westlake Mall downtown to kill some time. She's wandering around that funky, oversized chessboard that they have there, and she's watching the pigeons, and she's hoping that it doesn't rain, and she's hoping that the wet and worn shoelaces on her shoes don't snap, and she's keeping her eyes close to the concrete, and she's debating whether or not to return home. A place that Brianna would describe as overflowing with dysfunction and abuse. You see, when Brianna was very, very young, her mother began struggling with chronic addiction. She was physically abusive. Her father was ghost-like, absent, legendary, forlorn, and altogether vacant and gone. And over the years that were intended for childlike wonder and joy, the hula hoops and the long laughing, the beaches and the fairy tales, her mother's boyfriends took advantage of Brianna in the most intimate and terrible ways. She was sexually abused by many of them, often. And I have no idea how much courage it took for Brianna to endure, in particular, that very first time. But something inside me experiences wreckage and brokenness when I think about her 6 or 7-year-old hands clasping for some semblance of something safe, and her childlike eyes darting around the room to try to find and train on to something safe while she endured such intimate betrayal and pain. And the endless tears that must have followed when that first exploiter, that first time, left her alone in her room to gather herself, and the tears began to flow. So as Brianna turns the corner of the chessboard in Westlake, walking alone, she's interrupted and she hears, "Oh girl, you are so beautiful. Dang!" And she looks up to see a handsome older guy, and she blushes. "You want to hang out?" he says. And immediately swept up in his charm and desperate from the distraction of going home, she agrees. A quick walk over to McDonald's, and she spills everything about her drug-addicted mother and absent father and the abuse that she had endured and how she never wants to go home again. And with the dollar signs spinning in his mind, Mr. Charming listens to her, and she can tell by the way that he listens and the way that he looks at her, that he sees her and he knows her. And then, as if He'd been waiting all along for this very moment. He begins to paint the sweetest dream she's ever heard. And as he weaves it, he lands his hooks in. I knew there was a reason that I met you. I can't help but want to protect you, and I will not let anyone else ever hurt you again, and I'll make sure you have a nice place to stay, and we'll get your hair done and your nails done, and you'll be fed, and you will always be my girl, he promises her. And she is swept away by the fantasy of it all. His words fit right into the deepest vacancies and the deepest longings. Could it be true? And over the next couple of weeks or months, in some cases, she is well fed. She's got fresh hair. She's got fresh nails. She falls in love, and she knows without a doubt that he meant every word of what he said. And he hooks her. And then in a matter of days or weeks, Mr. Charming flips the switch. Baby, I want us to have all of the nicest things, and we could get there a lot faster if you just start doing a little bit of work on the side, and we're already having sex anyway, so if you just started getting paid for it. And because her fantasy looms in the balance, she agrees. And she takes a date. And she has sex with a stranger. And she smiles to that stranger, and she hates it. That was fun, she says, as she pays him, and the shame washes over her like a flood. Call me again soon, she says, and the tears return. One stranger paying for sex turns into 10, and then into 20, and then into a daily blur, which on average is 4,000 different men per year in the lives of domestic victims of sex trafficking in our country. And the dream has all but disappeared in this blur, and Mr. Charming's promises of love have deteriorated and devolved into realities of violence when she says that she wants to stop, and violence when she doesn't make her quota, and violence when she complains about having to give him all of the money that she has earned by selling her body to men she doesn't know. And those deepest vacancies left by her mother and her father and the compounded sexual abuse she has endured since childhood render her physiologically, psychosocially resigned to the reality that this is the only thing she was created to be and do. So, she is, and she does. And this is Brianna's story. And this is the story of hundreds of domestic victims of sex trafficking just like her in King County, 300 to 500 of which are underage, friends. Right now, today. Movements are made, and futures are changed when our deepest sorrows commingle with our greatest gifts. Movements are made when we relinquish the faulty paradigm that we live in a culture of scarcity, and we bear hug the reality that we live in a culture of abundance. Movements are made when we stop assuming that somebody else is going to be giving to the cause. And movements are made when we embrace the reality that even the most broken and terrifying and scandalous events and relationships and systems can be topped and toppled over when the community rallies and invests in redeeming stories just like Brianna's. We have the opportunity to refuse to believe the voice of the dominant culture when it comes to generosity. The voice of the dominant culture would say that, and aim to convince us that if we're not part of the problem, then we certainly don't need to be part of the solution. Movements are made when we give. When we give generously of our time and our talent and our treasure. And a dear friend and colleague of mine says that we must do what we love to fight what we hate. And I love telling stories even when they don't belong to me. Generosity not only transforms the lives of those who are being served by the organizations that we give to, but generosity transforms the giver. It connects the dots. Wherever your heart breaks, give. I read a terrific story about the Atlantic Ocean. And the Atlantic Ocean is a complicated and vast entity. There are things going on beneath the surface that shape what's happening on the surface. The Atlantic Ocean has informed our culture and trade and commerce and relationships for many, many years. And the author of this book laments that the Atlantic Ocean has been something that we simply think about flying over to get to point A to point B. And he laments that this vast and complicated and scandalous and beautiful, terrifying entity suffers the fate of the overlooked. So friends, let us look to the things that we care about and ensure that they do not suffer the same fate. Thank you.